Rossia was an armored cruiser of the Imperial Russian Navy built in the 1890s. She was designed as a long-range commerce radar and served as such during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904–05. She was based in Vladivostok when the war broke out and made a number of sorties in search of Japanese shipping in the early months of the war without much success. Rossia, along with the other armored cruisers of the Vladivostok Cruiser Squadron, attempted to rendezvous in the Strait of Tsushima with the main portion of the Pacific Fleet sailing from Port Arthur in August 1904, but were delayed and had to return to port without them. They encountered a Japanese squadron of 4 armored cruisers between them and a base shortly after they turned around. The Japanese sank the oldest Russian ship, Rurik, and damaged Rossia and Gromoboy during the Battle off Ulsan, but both Russian ships were repaired within 2 months. After the end of the war, Rossia returned to Kronstadt, where she underwent a 3-year refit that strengthened her armament. She was fitted with mine rails in 1914 and laid one minefield during World War I that damaged 2 German light cruisers. She was reconstructed beginning in late 1915 to further strengthen her armament, but played no part during the rest of the war as her crew became involved in revolutionary activities in 1917. She was taken over by the Bolsheviks in late 1917, but was put into reserve in 1918 and sold for scrap in 1922. Design. Rossia was originally intended to be a repeat of the armored cruiser Rurik, but the director of the Naval Ministry wanted the armor to cover more of the ship's side. However, the design went through a number of changes during late 1892 and early 1893 and incorporated a number of technological advances that had recently become available. One notable change was the deletion of Rurik's sailing rig. General characteristics: Rossia was 485 feet long overall. She had a maximum beam of 68.6 feet and a draft of 26.2 feet. She displaced 12,195 long tons, only 65 long tons more than design. Rossia was sheathed in wood and copper to reduce fouling. She was considered to be a good sea boat with a smooth roll, attributable to her tumble-home sides. Propulsion. In an effort to extend her range, Rossia was built with an unusual machinery arrangement. One large vertical triple expansion steam engine drove each of the outer propeller shafts, while a small cruising VTE engine drove the center shaft. At full speed, the center propeller had to be uncoupled as there was not enough steam to drive all 3 engines simultaneously. The outer propellers were uncoupled when cruising. The 2 main engines were designed for a total of 14,500 indicated horsepower, but they developed 15,523 IHP on trials and drove the ship to a maximum speed of 19.74 knots. The cruising engine developed 2,500 IHP. 32 Belleville water tube boilers provided steam for the engines. She could carry a maximum of 2,200 long tons of coal. This gave her a radius of action of 7,740 nautical miles at 10 knots. In 1898, some of the first large warship trials of oil fuel were carried out. Armament. Rossia's main armament consisted of 4 8-inch 45 caliber Patton 1892 guns, one at each end of the ship on each side, sponsored out over the tumble home of the ship's sides. They were protected by gun shields. The guns could be depressed to -5 degrees and elevated to 18 degrees. They fired 193.5-pound projectiles at a muzzle velocity of 2,950 feet per second, which gave a range of 12,000 yards at 13 degrees elevation. Her secondary armament consisted of 16 6-inch, 45 pattern 1892 guns. One gun was mounted under the forecastle and another in the stern. Neither gun could fire to the side. The remaining guns were mounted in hull embrasures. In the pivot mounts, the guns could depress to -6 degrees and elevate to +20 degrees. They fired 91.4-pound pattern 1907 high-explosive projectiles at a muzzle velocity of 2,600 feet per second. This gave a range of 12,600 yards at maximum elevation. Russia carried 210 rounds per gun. Defense against torpedo boats was provided by a variety of light-caliber weapons. 12 75mm Cano pattern 1892 50-caliber guns were mounted in sponsons on the upper deck, protected by gun shields. The gun fired 10.8-pound shells to a range of about 8,600 yards at its maximum elevation of 21 degrees with a muzzle velocity of 2,700 feet per second. The rate of fire was between 12 and 15 rounds per minute. A total of 20 47mm Hotchkiss guns were carried. They fired a 3.3-pound shell at a muzzle velocity of 1,476 feet per second at a rate of 20 rounds per minute to a range of 2,020 yards. 18-37mm Hotchkiss guns were also carried. They fired a 1.1-pound shell at a muzzle velocity of 1,450 feet per second at a rate of 20 rounds per minute to a range of 3,038 yards. 5 above-water 15-inch torpedo tubes were mounted. The exact type of torpedo carried likely changed over Russia's lifetime. The original 15-inch whitehead torpedo only had a maximum range of 440 yards at a speed of 29 knots and a 57-pound warhead. These were later replaced by an improved model with 2-speed, ranged settings and a 141-pound warhead. Its maximum range was 980 yards at a speed of 25 knots. Armor Russia used newly developed Harvey armor, which saved considerable weight over the steel armor used by Rurik for the same amount of protection. A waterline belt extended from the stern to 80 feet short of the bow. It extended 4 feet 6 inches above the waterline and 4 feet below the waterline. It was 8 inches thick amidships, but reduced to 6 inches fore and abaft the machinery spaces and to 5 inches at the stern. The belt tapered to a thickness of 4 inches at its lower edge. It was closed off at the forward end by a 7-inch transverse bulkhead. A protective 2.5 to 3-inch deck ran forward from the bulkhead to the bow. The main armored deck was 2 inches thick, but a 5-inch glacis projected above it to protect the tops of the engine cylinders. The conning tower had walls 12 inches thick. The funnel uptakes were protected by 3 inches of armor between the lower and middle decks. Operational history. Russia was built by the Baltic Works in St. Petersburg. Construction began in October 1893, although she was not formally laid down until the 20th of May 1895 and launched on the 30th of April 1896. After her launch, she was towed to Kronstadt for fitting out, but she was pushed onto a sandbar by a storm and required a month to free her. Russia entered service in late 1896 and participated in Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee Fleet Review in June 1897 at Spithead. She returned to Kronstadt to finish her trials before sailing for the Far East in October. She reached Nagasaki, Japan on the 10th of March 1898 and remained in the Pacific until the beginning of the Russo-Japanese War in 1904. Russo-Japanese War. At the start of the Russo-Japanese War, Russia was under the command of Captain Andrei Parfenovich Andreev, and was the flagship of the Vladivostok Cruiser Squadron under the overall command of Rear Admiral Karl Jessen. The other ships in the squadron were the armored cruisers Gromoboi and Rurik, as well as the protected cruiser Bogata. The squadron made a number of sorties against Japanese shipping early in the war, but only one was reasonably successful when the transporter Tachimaru, carrying 1828 cm siege howitzers and over 1,000 troops intended for the siege of Port Arthur, was sunk in June 1904. On an earlier sortie in May 1904, Russia flew an observation balloon off her quarterdeck to locate Japanese shipping, the first use of an aerial device by a warship on the high seas during a time of war. Battle off Ulsan. During the war, the bulk of the Russian Pacific Fleet was located in Port Arthur, where they were blockaded by the Japanese. On the 10th of August 1904, the ships at Port Arthur attempted breakout to Vladivostok, but were turned back in the Battle of the Yellow Sea. Admiral Jessen was ordered to rendezvous with them, but the order was delayed and his ships had to raise steam, so he did not sortie until the evening of the 13th of August. Bogata had been damaged earlier when she grounded and did not sail with the squadron. By dawn he had reached the island of Tsushima in the Tsushima Strait between Korea and Japan. He turned back for Vladivostok when he failed to see any ships from the Port Arthur squadron. 36 miles north of the island, he encountered the Japanese squadron commanded by Vice Admiral Kamimura Hikonojo, tasked to patrol the Tsushima Strait. The Japanese force had 4 modern armored cruisers, Awate, Izumo, Tokiwa, and Azuma. The 2 squadrons had passed during the night without spotting the other, and each had reverse course around first light. This put their Japanese ships astride the Russian route to Vladivostok. Admiral Jessen turned to the northeast when he spotted the Japanese at 5 o'clock a.m., and they followed suit, albeit on a slightly converging course. Both sides opened fire around 5:23 at a range of 8,500 meters. The Japanese ships concentrated the fire on Rurik, the rear ship of the Russian formation. She was hit fairly quickly and began to fall astern of the other 2 ships. Admiral Jessen turned southeast in an attempt to open the range, but this blinded the Russian gunners and prevented any of the broadside guns from bearing on the Japanese. About 6 o'clock, Admiral Jessen turned 180 degrees to starboard in an attempt to reach the Korean coast and to allow Rurik to rejoin the squadron. Admiral Kamimura followed suit around 6:10, but turned to port, which opened the range between the squadrons. Azuma developed engine problems around this time, so the Japanese squadron slowed to conform with her best speed. Firing recommenced at 6:24 and Rurik was hit 3 times in the stern, flooding her steering compartment so that she had to be steered with her engines. Her speed continued to decrease, further exposing her to Japanese fire, and her steering jammed to port around 6:40. Admiral Jessen made another 180 degrees turn in an attempt to interpose his 2 ships between the Japanese and Rurik, but the latter ship suddenly turned to starboard and increased speed and passed between Jessen's ships and the Japanese. Admiral Kamimura turned 180 degrees as well, so that both squadrons were heading southeast on parallel courses, but Admiral Jessen quickly made another 180 degrees turn so that they headed on opposing courses. Awate was hit around this time, which knocked out 3 6-inch and 1 12-pounder guns, killing 32 and wounding 43. The Japanese squadron opened the range again when it made a 180 degrees another turn to port. The Russians reversed course for the third time around 7:45 in another attempt to support Rurik, although Russia was on fire herself. Her fires were extinguished about 20 minutes later. Admiral Kamimura circled Rurik to the south at 8 o'clock and allowed the other two Russian ships to get to his north and gave them an uncontested route to Vladivostok. Despite this, Admiral Jessen turned back once more at 8:15 and ordered Rurik to make her own way back to Vladivostok before turning north at his maximum speed, about 18 knots. About this time Admiral Kamimura's two elderly protected cruisers, Nanawa and Takachiho, were approaching from the south. Their arrival allowed Kamimura to pursue Jessen with all of his armored cruisers. They fought a running battle with the Russians for the next hour and a half, scoring enough hits on them to force the speed down to 15 knots. Azuma's engines again broke down during this chase and she was replaced in the line by Tokiwa. The Japanese closed to a minimum of about 5,000 meters, but Admiral Kamimura then opened the range up to 6,500 meters. About 10 o'clock, Kamimura's gunnery officer erroneously informed him that Azuma had expended 3/4 of her ammunition and he turned back after a 5-minute rapid-fire barrage. He did not wish to leave the Tsushima Strait unguarded and thought that he could expend his remaining ammunition on Rurik. By this time she had been sunk by Nanawa and Takachiho, which had closed to 3,000 meters of Rurik in order to finish her off. They had radioed Admiral Kamimura that she was sunk, but he did not receive the message. Shortly after the Japanese turned back, Gromoboy and Russia were forced to heave to make repairs. Russia suffered only 44 dead and 156 wounded, far less than Gromoboy's 87 dead and 170 wounded. This was attributable to Russia's captain's policy of ordering the gun crews for his quick-firing guns on the engaged side to lay down and those on the unengaged side to go below, in contrast to the other ship keeping her light guns manned at all times. Russia had been hit 19 times on the starboard side of her hull and 9 on her port side, plus other hits in her funnels, boats and decks. She had half of her guns knocked out and a fire caused by the ignition of excess propellant charges. Despite this number of hits, she was not badly damaged because her waterline belt was not penetrated by any hit. She was repaired within 2 months by the rudimentary facilities available at Vladivostok. Russia made no further effort to interfere with Japanese shipping during the war. Interwar period, Russia returned to Kronstadt, arriving on the 8th of April 1906, where she was given a lengthy refit that was finished in 1909. Her engines and boilers were reconditioned, her mainmast was removed and she received additional 6-inch guns. 6 more guns in lightly armored casemates were added on the upper deck, positioned on each side in the intervals between the main deck 6-inch guns. In addition, the bow gun was moved to the upper deck to allow it to fire to each side. This increased the ship's broadside by 4 guns. Russia represented Russia at King George V's Coronation Fleet Review in June 1911. She departed Kronstadt in September 1912 for a training cruise to the Canaries and the Virgin Islands, returning to the Baltic in time to visit Copenhagen in March 1913 in company with the protected cruisers Aurora and Oleg. She left for another training cruise to the Azores in September 1913 and was cruising in the Mediterranean in April 1914. World War I. Russia served as the flagship of the 2nd Cruiser Brigade of the Baltic Fleet during World War I. She was modified to serve as a fast mine layer with a capacity of 100 naval mines before the war. In January 1915 she laid a minefield in company with Oleg and Bogata between Kiel and the Mecklenburg coast that damaged the German light cruisers SMS Augsburg and SMS Gazelle. She was reconstructed beginning in October 1915 at Kronstadt to increase her armament. Her forecastle deck was removed as well as the fore and aft 6-inch guns. They were replaced by two 8-inch guns mounted on the centerline forward, and another pair was mounted on the quarterdeck. These additions increased her broadside to 6 8-inch, but only 7 6-inch guns. Rossia's crew took an active part in the revolutionary movements in 1917 and came under control of the Soviet Red Fleet in September 1917. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk required the Soviets to evacuate the base at Helsinki in March 1918 to have them interned by newly independent Finland. Even though the Gulf of Finland was still frozen over, Russia sailed to Kronstadt in what became known as the Ice Voyage and was placed into reserve shortly after her arrival. She was sold to a German company for scrapping on 1 July 1922. While being towed to Germany, she grounded on the coast of Estonia, but was subsequently towed to Kiel and broken up.